So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to sharing my experience with policy writing, and feel free to leave your questions in the chat room. And Bava is going to be monitoring that as we go. So I'll give the presentation, and then for the last 10 to 15 minutes, we can leave for questions and answers. And, some of you I think don't know who I am. So I'm Anisa Abeytia, and I am the think tank program coordinator for GRN. Gonna let Bava introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Bava, and so I'm one of the junior fellows in the War, Conflict, Global Migration think tank.
Let me show the screen. Okay, so the workshop today is titled Policy Writing for Systemic Justice and the Public Good. And I titled it this way because there's different approaches you can take to policy writing. Per se, we're not going to be addressing here per se the way public administration deals with policy, or political science, or international relations. We're going to look at this really from a perspective of systemic justice in the public good. As at GRN, one of the key values that we have is investing in local communities, trying to better the systems within the local communities, national communities, and supranational policies, so that they reflect these ideas of inclusion and kindness and sustainability. So first, why use your research to inform policy? What are some of the main key factors, and why would it be important? One, it assists in learning how to write academically. It's a very different writing a policy memo than it is writing a research paper. It's a lot more directed. It's a lot more specific. Where you're dealing with an audience that doesn't have a lot of time. And we'll get a little bit more into what I mean rigorous. And it's also very situated in a real world issue. It doesn't really care about theoreticals. It cares about what is happening now and what are the possibilities for your research to then address those real world problems. When you learn how to craft a document that's based to the particular needs of an audience. So you would say you would want to be targeting, maybe civil society or a government agency, or your local community or the general public. So it's learning different writing skills, not just focusing on academic writing, but writing that also will help translate your research to different audiences, where your research can be used to change a certain aspect or improve something. And to prepare again to write non-academically. A lot of times academics don't learn how to write in different styles. As academics, you are experts in the field. You have information that policymakers, that local communities could really benefit from. But if you don't connect this, you don't have this bridge between being able to use language in a way that they understand. So this also prepares you to do that. It teaches you to be more client oriented. If you want to go into either the private or public sector, or again, introduce your research to a larger audience that isn't academic per se. And it also enables you to write very succinctly. There's not much room for creativity in policy writing. You're dealing again with people who are very limited in time, who don't have time to do the research themselves, or who don't have access to conduct research. So what's a policy memo? So it's a professional document, and it can vary in length from 1 page to 30 pages. But typically policy memos tend to be shorter than 30 pages. Typical length is about 3 to 5 pages. It's directed to a particular audience or audiences. It provides an analysis. and recommendations toward a specific issue, problem, or situation. So again, this is where it's very focused on a particular issue. Typically, it's only one problem, and you're giving one solution. Sometimes you can give one, two, or three, but typically it's one. It doesn't have a thesis statement, and it doesn't have a theoretical framework. What it does focus on, it focuses on this the evidence that you're going to provide. And it focuses on describing one or more specific policy recommendation, as I mentioned. Lawmakers and policymakers, they really prefer one recommendation at a time. Sometimes as someone who wants to suggest a solution or resolution for something, sometimes it doesn't work, that there can only be one solution. And as we move on with the policy workshop series, we'll talk more about trying to break that mold, trying to get policymakers to see that it's not just black and white. And a lot of times you see in how policy is implemented and how it's written, is that it's really out of sync with the real world. They're very concerned with the real world. It doesn't apply many times to the situation or to the community that it's trying to impact. And that's why I think it's very important for people who are researchers, who are trained to think in multiple ways, not just a straight line and not just in one discipline, but who can bring up these nuances to be able to recommend more than one solution. So how is a policy memo different than a policy brief? So a policy brief typically is something that you will be hired or commissioned or requested to do by a particular individual or an organization or a government agency. So it's geared towards an audience. You already know who your audience is. So you don't have to guess or think who your audience is. It's very clear. Whoever commissioned the piece, that is who your audience is. And it's very similar to, you would say, like a report, but it has a unique structure that we will go into at the very end. And this audience tends to want a specific outcome. So one time I had written a book chapter about Syrian refugees integration in Norway, and someone at UNESCO read it, and I wrote a paragraph about higher education integration. And from reading that, they asked me to write a policy brief on higher education integration in Norway. So I knew exactly who I was writing for and what I was writing for. So a policy memo has, you have a lot more leeway in what you're going to write about. And the policy brief tends to be longer. They tend to be between 20 to 40 pages. And who is your audience for a policy memo? So again, unlike the commissioned policy brief, your audience can be geared towards any group that you particularly want to impact. However, it's good to have either one, two, or three audiences in mind. Something that I like to do with op-eds, because there's a lot of overlap between op-eds and policy memos, is I might write the same policy memo, but for different audiences. If I'm writing an op-ed that's, say, geared towards a government, I'll write it a lot differently. The language will be a lot different. I'll bring in a lot more numbers. I'll bring in a lot more case studies. Let's say if I'm going to write something for a general audience, it'll be a little bit more human interest. And I did that after I did a fact-finding mission to Germany one time. And I outlined the recommendations that I had for the German government in regards to integrating refugees through the programs that I saw in Germany that civil society was organizing. And then I brought that in a different way to the general audience, where I talked more about the people that I saw and the people that I interacted with, and how these organizations and their programs were positively impacting their lives. And the other thing is you want to think about, are you going to look at practitioners, because that's a different audience? Are you going to look at large organizations, let's say like International Rescue Committee or the UN? But the most important thing is that the language you use is accessible and understandable. You always want to think about an educated audience, but they may not be an expert in their field. They may not know a lot about your topic. So you're kind of pre-digesting the information for them as the expert and delivering it to them in whatever language needs to be done and whatever method needs to be done. And the same thing here is for the policy memo. What is the language of that organization that you're writing for? So again, accessible, understandable. So here, I'm going to go into kind of a few issues and topics that you should think about when you're writing a policy memo. And one of them is that they're very problem driven. There's a problem in the world. Let's say communities that have a lot of essential workers aren't getting COVID vaccines. How would you then address that in a policy memo? So your audience might need to be your local government and maybe council members, people sitting on your local council. And you want to say it should be a top priority to vaccinate essential workers. And you can say because it's a public good, because they're the people that are constantly interacting with everybody. They're the first point of contact. They're preparing food, they're teaching our children. So you can make these types of arguments. So again, you identify an issue, and then you decide how you're going to frame that issue, which goes into focus on analysis. So here, this is where you're going to display your expertise. What do you research about? What are you passionate about? What have you done field work in? What does your data say? And then you translate that into a clear policy objective and what evidence is going to support your policy recommendations. And one of the things that I found is that you don't ever use a passive voice or a passive sentence structure. You always use an active voice in policy writing. And remember, just like any audience, they're used to reading a specific type of way. And just like if you are writing, say, if you're reading a book of fiction, or you pick up a book in your field, you have the hook at the front. And one of those hooks is the language. They like that active language because it's very problem oriented. It's very now oriented. Unfortunately, a lot of policy isn't forward looking. And again, this is the second reason why I think it is so important for academics to get into and start writing policy, because a lot of the research we do is very forward thinking. It's looking about not just today, tomorrow, but maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. Again, it's evidence-based. There's not a theoretical framework for policy memos. Instead, what they're looking at is, if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, which they do a lot in public policy, your field research. What is the literature saying? Did you do field research and then you came back and you saw that there was a whole vein of literature supporting what you saw in the field and what you want to recommend? So that's how you're building your argument through evidence, but it's not a debate. So whether it's you're basing it on a book you already wrote, an article that you wrote, a field work that you conducted, this is where after the analysis you bring in this information to support your overall argument. And this is really, I pulled this from a source at USC, and this is a part of the handout that I sent you, part of the resources. It's a really nice explanation of policy briefs. And so what it's saying is that in a policy brief, you're not really arguing ever for the status quo. Policy brief should always be you're introducing a new recommendation. You're introducing a new idea. But if you want to argue that this program is working and effective and it shouldn't be changed. In one policy brief that I wrote, I was saying that Norway had eliminated this particular program that was very effective in bringing refugees into work, and that it was cost effective, it used the local community, and that it should be reinstated. So essentially I was arguing for the status quo because this program was working and that it shouldn't be cut. So there are times when you do that, but typically you are arguing for a new approach. So we'll get into the structure. If you look online, or if you take a class in policy writing, you'll see that the structure varies greatly. You can have an executive summary at the beginning or at the end. Some ask for methods, some don't. There's different types of templates, but I'm going to give you kind of just the basic outline. And the headings of the template, they're not meant to be labels for you to insert into your policy memo. Those are just there to let you know, like, okay, this is this component and this should go here. And here's the another component here. But that heading should reflect your topic. Whatever in that paragraph, in those pages, that should be the heading. So the first part of the structure is the executive summary. You may want to do it at the beginning. You may want to do it at the end. And we're going to talk about this a lot more in the next session. The next is the introduction. And you have the issue analysis. You have the method and the motivation. You have the proposed solution. And you have the actual recommendation or recommendations. You have the limitations. And then you have, at the end, the conclusion. So this is the basic structure. And today's workshop is meant to just be an introduction to just bring the main points of policy writing. And I used to work in policy, and unless you're coming in with policy background because you were in the School of Public Administration or in international relations, you're not going to come in with policy experience. And I found that policy writing is serving as a gatekeeper. A lot of academics don't know how to do it unless you're in those fields. You don't have access to it. Another main way that people in the field gain access and knowledge is through internships. And if you are not a political science major, if you're not in international relations or in School of Government, it's very hard to gain access to those internships. So in closing, we're going to kind of do a little exercise, and you can start thinking about how to integrate policy writing into your research and start thinking about how to convert your research into policy writing. And I'm gonna send you the handout as well, so you don't have to worry about writing this down, but just to start thinking about it. So the first question is, what problems does your research potentially address? Here again, you want to be very clear with the issue that's going to be addressed. It could be, you could start with what was your research question, or pick one of your research questions, or you might want to write a policy memo for each of your research questions. So you would break it down to that, to just one question, identify one problem. Next, who's the policy audience? You want to be very clear with yourself. And again, like I said, you can have multiple audiences. You can have your local community. It can be national. It can be supranational. Is it aimed at a government agency, civil society, or NGO? So you can decide to write 1, 2, 3, 4. You can turn them into op-eds. You can turn them into human interest stories. One of the nice things about being able to write in different styles is that you are bringing more attention to your writing. You're having more people read it. So that when you do, say you want to meet with a policymaker to actually present your memo to them, you can say, look, this many people have read my research, and this is the feedback that I've got from people in your community. So one of the things that I had proposed to, and we were talking about our think tank on climate change, is they want to have a workshop, a roundtable panel discussion about water rights and climate refugees. Once they have their event, once they invite the local population and local governments and all the stakeholders, they're in a good position then to co-author a policy memo that's directed at their local government. So this is kind of how I envision post-workshop how this would go. That you could work collaboratively with your think tanks to start thinking about what, do you want to work on a problem jointly and decide, where you want to impact, at what level, at what question, and what issue. And the next question is, does your research provide any solutions to problems? And if they do, start thinking about, how you can use your research to provide very succinct recommendations. Typically, when you work in policy, they call them asks. In the United States, they call them asks. So you would approach a policymaker, you would set a meeting with them, and you would say, okay, here are my 3 asks. And they typically ask you for your asks before you meet. And here you want them to be very succinct. One of the critiques that policymakers and the general public have is that, we want to give off the appearance of being an expert, because you are an expert. So you want to show this expertise, which leads to the next question is, can you explain your policy issues in 200 words or less? And this is what it really boils down to, because the critique is that academics ramble. They give too much information. They want to bring up all of these nuances. They can't cut down their research to a digestible amount for a lawmaker or a government official to understand. Now, when I worked with policymakers, whether it was in Germany, Norway, Sweden, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, the United States, you're given maybe 5 minutes. You're given maybe 10 minutes. And in that time, you really want to present yourself as a confident expert. You really know your research backwards and forwards. But a lot of times it's hard to articulate it in less than 200 words if you haven't practiced. And this is why I provided just this very basic rubric for you to start writing in. Okay, this is what I want to say. And I'm sure you all heard of elevator pitches. And too, I mean, this helps when you go to conferences or you want to write grants. How can you succinctly explain what it is that you do? So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. There's a lot more that I can say, but I want to hear what you have to say too, because I think a lot of you maybe are new to policy writing. And I'll go ahead and if anybody has any questions or comments. Should I
There's a
continue?
question.
Okay.
There's a question on the chat. So it's by Lorna, and it says, "Is there a difference between writing a policy brief and a feasibility study?"
Yes. A feasibility study has to do, again, it would be more in line with a policy brief than a policy memo. A feasibility report, it's not providing a solution. It's analyzing whether or not something's possible. And you're looking at the pros and cons, where a policy memo does look at the pros and cons, but it's not per se looking at the feasibility. Where there's an overlap is policy memos do address limitations. They address kind of where are the pitfalls in what you're proposing. In one policy memo that I wrote, the limitation that I had said was that, if you are requiring volunteers, one of the drawbacks is that you have to rely on people's goodwill and you have to hire someone to work with the volunteers and manage the volunteers. So there is that. So yeah, there's that. That's the difference. You're looking at a potential where a policy memo is recommending specific recommendations to solving something. Think back to what I had mentioned about COVID vaccines and essential workers. It wouldn't be, is it feasible to give them vaccines? A policy memo is saying it is essential to give them vaccines. And here is how that can happen. You could say, you would set up free vaccination sites in these communities and give them priority to accessing the vaccines. And since they work, you would want to make them available outside of work hours. You might want to open them earlier. You might want to open them later.
Yeah. I have a question as well. Shall I ask you or shall I put it on the chat, Anisa?
No, you can go ahead and ask.
So if your research is on the social science area and you're trying to write in a policy brief kind of way, how would you recommend, would you give any advice for people who, let's say, have like a legal history sort of a point of view where it's like it seems not practical? How would we frame it in a policy brief writing?
Well, it would be helpful to have kind of a better idea of what is not possible.
Mm-hmm.
Social sciences really lend themselves to policy memos, particularly sociology, because they tend to be more quantitative geared, where anthropology is more qualitative geared. Economics as well. You get a lot of policy memos, particularly in the United States. Most of our policy is driven by economics, then say by sociology. And that's where you get this writing and why I wanted to introduce this to you. When I approached policy, the very first thing I had published was In the Hill. which is the congressional blog in the United States. And essentially what I wanted to say was that it was more of a security threat not accepting Syrian refugees than accepting them. At that time, that was not seen as feasible. And when we went into the Trump era, we saw that it wasn't feasible. Um, I think that if you're basing your policy memo on something that you've seen or experienced, and a lot of our research is based on that when you're in the social sciences. If you're going into a local community and you see, well, these asylum laws are not working for these people. This integration policy isn't working for this group of people. Um, the way that the school systems, the way that they're teaching English as a second language is not working. Essentially, you're basing it on work that you've done within some community context. So if you're basing it on that, it's feasible. Now, it might be cost prohibitive. A lot of times that's what you get, that it's cost prohibitive. But you can say in the long run, it is. And I'll give you an example for my graduate work. I'm not doing a thesis. I'm doing what's called an applied project. And essentially what I'm saying, and this would fall under it's not feasible, is most of the European countries have shifted their integration policy to require refugees to either enter the workforce or go to school. And it's a huge shift away from refugee-centered policy. And what I'm looking at is the actual integration process. That it's part of this colonial civilization project, the white man's burden. And these systems are not designed to effectively integrate this population with human rights in mind. The West really holds the global South in that location until they want either their physical labor or their intellectual labor. So what I'm arguing is that European countries are not going to reach their policy goal of having a workforce based on asylum seekers because their integration system isn't designed to bring them into society. They will always be in a precarious situation. They will not have steady work. So I'm saying you need to change the integration policy and base it on human rights if you are to seriously reach your goal of work readiness. And I'm basing it on field work that I did in Norway, that I actually saw what the local community was doing, what refugees were doing, what the municipality was doing, what the civil society was doing, what the institutions like the universities were doing to help integrate these refugees. And I call it active integration. There's a lot of passivity in integration. You have to have the refugees working towards integrating. You have to have the different local organizations. So that's kind of how I put it together. So when I say like it has to be rigorous and analysis, you really have to think about how are these policy structures working and at what level do you want to impact. For lack of better words, the easiest way to enter into the policy world is locally, because that's where you're based. This is where you're getting your information from. And that's where I started from and where a lot of politicians start from, is looking at what is the need in my local community. Now, how can I then translate that information into things and into actions that my local leaders will then take up? And then those local leaders take it to national, and then national to supranational. Because I've been fortunate enough to be able to influence US policy and also UN policy.
Thank you, Anisa. There's another question in the chat as well. So Jasmine says, I think you briefly mentioned some different writing styles. Could you say a little more about them?
Yes, sure. So My original degree is as a creative writer. So I've been writing for over 20 years in various styles. I have degrees in the humanities and in sciences as well. So I spent a lot of time as as a science writer for the general public. So I naturally lean to try to explain things to a general audience. Now, when you don't want to speak down to them, because most people when they pick up an article, it's because they're interested in it. So say I you have I had mentioned the op-ed and human interest stories. You can also do interviews. You can also write creatively. More and more you see social sciences embracing creative endeavors, whether it's poetry or music or different forms of art, different forms of creative writing. I took part of my field research over the last 6 years with Syrians, and I started turning them into what's called microfiction. And it was essentially I wanted people to be able to connect and feel what the people I interviewed felt. We've all experienced loss. We've all experienced heartbreak. We've all, most of us have experienced. These are all human feelings. We may not have experienced being a refugee or having lost our home, but we know pain. And so I used those short microfictions to kind of amplify the research that I was doing. Not everyone's a creative writer, and that's fine. But another thing is that you can do as well is op-eds. These are really the best way to share your work, and there's different um, platforms, whether they're print or whether they're online or whether it's a blog on social media. One of the best ways to start engaging is Medium, and it's just an open platform. And one of the things that happens is that when you get I think over 100 engagements, then one of the bigger, like say, Medium World will pick up your article. And I've had that happen the both times that I wrote for Medium, because sometimes you just want to write. You just want to share your ideas and get it out there. You want to start a debate. You want to start a conversation. And if you don't already know editors or haven't previously written, because you do have to write for free at first. One time I was hired to write a column, an op-ed column every week uh, on issues regarding Syria. So I had a platform there. And it does get easier. Just how, when you first start to, write your thesis, it's difficult. And so that op-ed is they're typically between 700 to 100 and 1,500 words. So you're really condensing what you're doing. Um, and there can be different themes. Another way is a human interest story. There's a lot of these now about you take, say, maybe a central character, a central participant in your work, someone you interviewed, and of course you need to obtain their approval and to write about it. Or say you were doing field research and you saw something, and you want to share that. When I was working for the Census Bureau, I was driving around Los Angeles, and per se it wasn't research, but I got to see parts of the city that I grew up in ways that I've never seen before, because I was interacting with people at a very, very individual level, and just seeing how just a 20-minute drive, you had extreme poverty and extreme wealth. Well, I could use that to talk about how COVID exposed uh, how we have this gross inequity in the United States. And there were murals everywhere. And to me, these murals in these communities that would be considered poor were full of hope. And so I use that as the murals, this visual depiction as, okay, here we are in this neighborhood that's falling apart. They don't have essential services. Their streets are falling apart. There's homeless encampments within neighborhoods. People, families are living with this. This shouldn't happen. And I drive 20 minutes to, another neighborhood, and there's this extreme wealth and extreme privilege. Why? I mean, shouldn't our tax money go to help these other neighborhoods because they're part of our community? And addressing, and I used another example of like the cats and cows and animals, how when you're when they give birth, they help each other. But in the United States, we don't. It's like you give birth and it's like you've committed this grave sin and you should be punished for it. And really, you feel like you're being punished for it. You give birth and like within 2 to 3 weeks, you have to get up and go back to work. And where do you leave this child? Because there's really no child care here, that you have to pay for everything. So, I mean, just things like that, things that you can think of, like how could this grab an audience's attention? And it takes time, but it does. I like templates. I like to just kind of write using templates that I create when I work with students to teach them how to write this way. I just say, okay, here's the template, fill it out. And as you become more skilled and more expert, it'll be easier to write this way. Again, it's a muscle, just like when we write academically. And even to, looking at it from a more practical perspective, as academia is shrinking and kind of downsizing, we need to show more creative ways of how we're impactful. And there's different ways to show that. And universities are more and more looking at our social media interaction and analytics on that, and also, how much we're writing. And even too, even if you're writing a blog, it shows that you're engaged. You may not be writing a whole, research article or an academic journal, but you're showing that you're engaged. So this are also things that are very good for your resume. Looking for jobs and looking for tenure. And thank you for your questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them on the chat, or there's no other questions right now, so you can continue if you want, Anisa.
Okay, sir. Well, let me open it for this. Does anybody want to go over the prompt? Say maybe the first problem. What problem do you think your research can address? So they're kind of very basic question, just to kind of get us started. Would it be helpful if I give examples for the writing prompt, or is it all kind of very self-explanatory? And we're going to kind of get into it more in the second session.
Yeah, I think we have someone who would like to participate.
And feel free to unmute yourself as well. You don't have to put them in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you. So my question there for the first prompt would be, when I think of my research, I have several very broad issues and then more very concrete, smaller issues. Mm-hmm. So are there any ones that are more suitable for this format? Or how to decide? Does it just depend on the audience, or? personal preference?
Well, since it would be easier to start with the most concrete problem, because you already have a good idea of what the problem is, and more than likely who the audience is, and probably also what recommendations you would make. But it doesn't mean that the ones that seem more abstract aren't. When I started my applied project, my research, what I wanted to focus on was the social inclusion of refugees. That's really broad, and I had to keep narrowing it down until I came up with that I was going to focus on work readiness programs and how integration programs impact that, whether it impacts it positively or negatively. And then it gave me a better idea of kind of what research would I do, how would I approach this, what was my motivation for approaching this. So it could, sometimes the topic that we're most passionate about, we have more drive to pursue it. And when one is trying to make social change and have social impact, a lot of times the thing that you're most passionate about is the one that gives you the energy and the motivation and drive to continue, because these types of changes happen over years. They don't happen right away. It has to be, you write one policy memo, you meet with an official, you write another policy memo, you meet with another official. So it can be that way. And as part of the additional reading, I included a one-page policy memo. And it just like really condensed everything into just one page where it answers basic questions in the format. So you can see, and ultimately you would want to be able to present your research in that format. And it's really thinking about, it's exercising your brain in a different way, because as academics, kind of more is better. But for policy, less is better. Being nuanced is kind of, as academics, is what you want to do. As for policy memos, that's not the case. They want black and white, but the world isn't black and white. So it's a matter of figuring out ways on how to keep the nuances and how to keep how to keep it focused and pointed and very rigorous writing. The first couple of times that I did try to write policy memos, and I played with it a little bit, and I get published more when I write as a white middle-aged male. Now I've found places where I can write more like have a feminine voice, or a voice that's not so aggressive and pointed. And this is also why I like medium, because when I just want to write whatever I want to write, I can write it there. So there's a lot to do with voice and tone and the type of words that you choose. But I find a lot of times policy memos are aggressive, and they like that aggressiveness because it is a male field, and that's why it's so much a gatekeeper. But it's so important to be able to bring your research and the people that you've met. And I think a lot of us do our work because we want to make positive changes. But how do we do that? And really, it's through policy. It's through changing laws. Our societies are supposed to reflect our quote unquote values and human rights and inclusiveness. But I think we see more and more that our laws don't reflect those values at all. And this is one way to help correct that.
Sorry, there's just one more question as well. I'll just add that on. So the question is, how do we start to gain exposure outside of academia?
Well, one way is, an easy way is social media. I personally kind of shy away from Twitter, although this is the best way to get your voice out there. That's one way. But I think op-eds are also another good way. But again, there you have to submit your work if you're going to write an op-ed, or else you can use platforms like Media or blogs. But social media is a really easy way, especially if you start a public Facebook page. You can get people engaged, although there's issues with the algorithm, but you can share what you're for posting on Facebook pages to different social media platforms, so that you're just sharing, you're not recreating information. And that's kind of how I started, was just kind of asking people that were in my own network, and then my network grew, and then like I had 5,000 friends, and then I had over 3,000 followers that I had to make a public page, and then I realized that what I was saying had resonance with other people, and I think the more and more we share our ideas, and this was supposed to be the liberating part of social media, which didn't happen, was getting this breadth of different ideas and exposure to different thoughts, and how people see the world in different parts of the world, and how we're similar. And I kind of found that on social media, and then I started writing. Just whoever would publish my work, I would just write, and then people would read it, and it would show up on when you would Google things, my article would show up, or my video would show up, and then it would attract more people to read what I was doing. So it's just more important to start, even if it's small. I mean, there's this book called Atomic Habits, and essentially he's saying, you do 1% every day. You just decide, okay, this is my goal, and now I'm going to write every single day, or I'm going to write on the weekends, and I'm going to pick this format.
Thank you, Anisa. There's just a follow-up, a small follow-up. I think this will be the last question we can take. So it says, my PhD research is applied and currently so, but I wonder if a way to start proposing policy changes as an outcome in the thesis itself, as an addendum, is that appropriate?
You're going to have to one, talk to your advisor, and if you want to include it, or to your institution, the program that I'm part of, we can choose an applied project or a thesis. And the applied project essentially is a policy brief with a policy memo as the deliverable. And that's what we're expected to publish, that policy memo. So it's hard to find a lot of information on how to do an applied project. Because essentially it's a policy brief in kind of a longer format. It would be like considered a report to like maybe an NGO. They have a program and you're analyzing it. But on your own, you could also do that. Last year, I wanted to kind of exercise my policy memo writing, and I entered a policy memo writing contest just to get some feedback. And there's not a lot of them, but that's one way you can do that. And I'm hoping that as we go through these workshops, that you will be able to start writing, because this prompt is for you to take with you. And if you're going to join the second workshop, we're going to start looking at this, because the next workshop is going to be 90 minutes. So we'll have time to focus on that. And then the third workshop, we're hoping that we'll get to a point where you'll be able to start being able to fill in that template of a policy memo for yourself. And once you start really thinking about, and that these prompts are there to help you to start structuring your thoughts and how you're going to analyze these things. whatever your topics are. But yeah, policy memo would be very relevant for a thesis, because then it would have real world application. And I think it's all the time we have for today. I hope this was helpful to you, and looking forward to seeing you. Believe it's next, let's see here, in June.
Yeah.
So June 15th at 4 p.m. And once we open up the registration for that, I'll send that out. I will send you the writing prompt, and there's space for you to write there. And one of the things that I like to do with my writing students is bring up different styles with writing. Writing with a pencil, writing with a pen, writing with a computer. They trigger different parts of our mind. There's been extensive research on this. So I invite you, to print out, if you can, the writing prompts, and use a pencil, because it triggers to your mind that it's okay to make mistakes. Don't think you're going to come to this and be able to nail it out right away. These are just for you to start writing and thinking. And the best writing implement to do that is a pencil. The next one is a pen. So again, thank you. And I'll send that out to you, and then you can work on that and have it hopefully prepared by June. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your week and a wonderful weekend.